She had not enlisted to become a legend, nor had she dreamed of heroics under fire. When she signed her name on the papers, she imagined stability, a paycheck, and a chance to escape the small-town life that felt too narrow for her restless spirit. Her assignment seemed straightforward: cook. Nothing glamorous, nothing dangerous. The military always needed people to feed the endless tide of soldiers. She figured she would spend her service behind stoves, ladles, and stockpots, making meals for those who bore the burden of combat. But life in a war zone doesn't always respect the boundaries of duty titles. At the forward operating base where she was stationed, the line between safety and danger was razor thin. The base itself was a patchwork of sandbags, steel barriers, and makeshift buildings huddled under a sun that baked everything to dust. From dawn until dusk, the air carried the constant hum of generators, the occasional rumble of Humvees, and sometimes the distant thunder of artillery. For her, mornings meant chopping onions while the world outside threatened to fall apart. She moved quietly in the kitchen, her hands precise as she diced vegetables or stirred giant vats of stew. The other cooks respected her discipline. She worked with the efficiency of someone who took pride in the smallest details. Meals in a war zone weren't just food, they were morale. Soldiers looked forward to hot plates after long patrols, and she understood the weight of that responsibility. Yet, while her fellow cooks lost themselves in banter or music, she kept her attention elsewhere. Her eyes were always wandering. When soldiers returned from patrol, she listened not intrusively, but attentively as they talked about ambushes, firefights, the smell of cordite still clinging to their uniforms. At night, while she scrubbed pots, she could hear the muffled cracks of rifles at the range, the pop-pop-pop of training sessions. Unlike the others in the kitchen, she was drawn to it, as if some invisible thread pulled her toward the sound of gunfire. She began visiting the range whenever she had a break. It started innocently enough. She wanted to understand what the others were talking about, to feel what it was like to hold the weapon that seemed to define their lives. The first time she lifted an M4 rifle, it felt awkward in her hands, cold, metallic, heavy with responsibility. But when she pulled the trigger, there was something strangely natural in the way her body adjusted. Her stance wasn't perfect. Her grip needed work, yet her shots landed closer to the bullseye than anyone expected. Word spread quietly. "She's just a cook," some said with a shrug, but the evidence was there. Holes clustered tight on paper targets, each shot deliberate and controlled. She didn't giggle or celebrate like someone impressed with themselves. Instead, she reset the target calmly, as if accuracy was the only outcome she had anticipated. A few of the soldiers began to take notice. They offered tips, showed her how to adjust her scope, corrected her breathing. And she absorbed it all like a sponge, grateful for every lesson. She wasn't practicing to prove a point. There was no ego in it, no desire to outshine the combat-trained soldiers around her. Something deeper drove her an instinct, perhaps that one day this skill would matter. Outside the wire, the war raged on. Convoys rolled out daily, sometimes returning with fewer vehicles than they'd left with. News of ambushes reached the base almost every week. Soldiers joked to mask their fear, but the truth was always there, unspoken. Danger was only ever minutes away. Inside the kitchen, she stayed quiet. She was the one who handed them their plates, the one who noticed when a soldier's hands shook as he reached for bread, the one who silently slipped extra portions to the ones who looked gaunt from stress. To many, she was background unseen, but necessary, like the hum of the generator or the rhythm of the mess hall line. Yet she watched everything, memorized details, and carried them with her. At night, she wrote in a small journal. She didn't record recipes or grocery lists. She wrote about the base, about the soldiers she served, about the way war seemed to change people. She never imagined her own name would one day be spoken with reverence. She thought her role was to observe, to serve, to make life bearable in small ways. But war has a habit of rewriting destinies in the blink of an eye. Sometimes, as she lay in her bunk, she thought about her family back home. They believed she was safe because she was just a cook. She didn't tell them about the sirens that sometimes wailed in the night when mortar fire came too close, or the way her heart raced when helicopters roared overhead carrying wounded men. She wanted to keep their peace intact, even as her own was chipped away. And yet, beneath the fear, there was always that quiet pull, the sense that she was standing on the edge of something larger than herself. The soldiers around her respected her work ethic, but they didn't know what was happening inside her mind. They couldn't see how carefully she studied their movements at the range, how she replayed their stories in her head, how she pictured herself in their place, not out of envy, but out of preparation. She didn't wish for battle, but she wanted to be ready if battle ever found her. War doesn't always ask permission. It doesn't knock politely on the kitchen door and wait for you to put down your spatula. It arrives uninvited, ruthless, tearing down whatever lines humans draw between combat and non-combat. Deep down, she must have understood that. The quiet beginning of her story was not glamorous, not heroic. It was long hours over steaming pots, greasy aprons, and the constant smell of food clinging to her skin. But in those long hours, she sharpened something invisible: discipline, patience, awareness. While others dismissed her as background, she was quietly building the foundation for the moment when the world would demand more of her than anyone expected. No one looked twice at the cook who walked through the mess hall with trays of cornbread. No one thought the woman who handed them mashed potatoes might one day hold their lives in her hands. And she herself never claimed she would. But the war was watching. The war, in its cruel and unpredictable way, was waiting. Waiting for the moment when the cook would no longer be a cook. Waiting for the moment when she would step into the fire and reveal what she truly was. And that moment was coming sooner than anyone could imagine. When she first stepped onto the shooting range, no one expected much. Soldiers often brought non-combat staff out there for fun: clerks, drivers, medics, and yes, even cooks. Most of them fired a few rounds, laughed at their poor aim, and went back to their routines. She could have been the same. She could have giggled at the recoil, shrugged at the holes scattered far from the bullseye, and returned to stirring stew. But that wasn't what happened. Her first attempt surprised everyone, including herself. The rifle bucked, but her body instinctively absorbed the shock. The shots landed tighter than expected, forming a cluster instead of a wild scatter. The soldiers watching raised their eyebrows. Maybe it was beginner's luck. But then she reloaded, adjusted slightly, and did it again. And again, it wasn't luck. She had an eye for precision. Over the next few weeks, she returned to the range every chance she got. When the kitchen quieted and her chores were done, she slipped away. Sometimes she went alone, practicing in silence. Other times, she trained alongside infantrymen who couldn't quite figure her out. She wasn't loud, she wasn't boastful, but her bullets told the story. There was something different about the way she approached shooting. For many, the range was a chore, just another part of the job. For her, it was meditation. She broke the process down into steps: breathing, posture, trigger squeeze, sight alignment. Each motion was deliberate, controlled. She wasn't just firing rounds, she was studying herself. One soldier, a seasoned sergeant, noticed her consistency. He leaned against the sandbags, watching her reload. "You shoot like someone who's been doing this a long time," he said. She shook her head. "First time was here." He frowned. "No way. Nobody groups like that without years behind a scope." But it was true. She had never touched a firearm before the military. Back home, guns had been something distant, belonging to hunters or police officers. Yet here she was, dropping rounds into the center of a target as though it were second nature. The sergeant offered tips, curious to see how far she could push herself. He explained wind drift, showed her how to control her heartbeat, and even lent her a sniper manual he'd kept from his training days. She studied it quietly at night, pages tucked inside her journal. While others relaxed with cards or music, she read diagrams and notes, memorizing every line. Her fellow cooks teased her at first. "What, planning to trade your spatula for a sniper rifle?" They joked. She smiled, but said nothing. She didn't need to explain. The truth was, she wasn't training for glory or recognition. She was training because something inside her whispered that she might need this skill someday. And that whisper grew louder with every passing week. The war outside the wire didn't ease. Reports of ambushes reached the base with unnerving frequency. Convoys hit by roadside bombs. Patrols pinned down by sniper fire. Helicopters rushing out with the wounded, sometimes not coming back fast enough. She listened as soldiers swapped stories, their voices low, their eyes hard. Each account fed the quiet certainty in her chest. Sooner or later, danger would arrive at their doorstep. And when it did, she would not be helpless. Her accuracy became a quiet rumor. Soldiers who saw her shoot told others. Some dismissed it. So what? She's a cook. She'll never see combat. Others weren't so quick to laugh. Maybe. But if she's this good now, imagine what she could do under pressure. The SEALs stationed near the base heard about her too. Elite operators rarely wasted their time on gossip, but even they grew curious. One afternoon, a pair of SEALs showed up at the range while she was practicing. They leaned against a Humvee, arms crossed, watching silently as she took her shots. When she finally lowered her rifle, one of them spoke. "Not bad, Chef." She glanced over, caught off guard by the nickname, but said nothing. "You ever think about putting down the ladle and picking up a scope full-time?" the other SEAL asked. She shook her head. "That's not my job?" The first SEAL smirked. "Maybe not. But talent doesn't care about job titles." They left without saying more, but their words lingered in her mind. The truth was, she didn't want to abandon her role. The kitchen mattered. Feeding soldiers mattered. She'd seen the way hot food softened their edges after brutal missions. She understood that morale was sometimes as important as bullets. But she also knew there was something inside her she couldn't ignore, something waiting, coiled, ready. Late at night, lying awake in her bunk, she imagined scenarios. What if the base was attacked? What if a sniper pinned down the guard towers? What if soldiers fell and no one could respond in time? Her mind always reached the same conclusion. She could help. She could do something. This duality defined her days. In the mess hall, she ladled soup with quiet efficiency, blending into the background. On the range, she was transformed, focused, sharp, deadly accurate. Few saw both sides of her. Fewer still understood how the two identities could exist in the same woman. But war is not a place for neat categories. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she stood at the edge of the range, staring at a target pocked with holes, clustered tightly in the center. The sergeant who had been coaching her stepped up beside her. "You ever wonder why you're this good?" he asked. She thought about it. "No, No, I have to be." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Sometimes, the war chooses people before they realize it. She didn't respond, but his words sank deep. Back in the kitchen that night, she returned to her familiar duties, stirring pots, seasoning trays of meat, washing dishes until her hands were raw. But her mind wasn't in the kitchen anymore. It was on the range, on the targets, on the possibility of what might come. The other cooks laughed and teased each other, trying to keep spirits high. She smiled faintly at their jokes, but her thoughts were far away. She wasn't waiting for combat, but she wasn't hiding from it either. If it came, she would meet it head on. Her transformation was invisible to most. To them, she was still just the quiet woman behind the steam table. But beneath the surface, something powerful was taking shape. She was no longer just a cook. She was something else now, though the world hadn't seen it yet. And when the day came that the war finally tested her, no one would ever look at her the same way again. The morning began like any other. The desert sun had barely lifted above the horizon, spilling a muted orange light across the forward operating base. The air was already heavy with dust, clinging to every surface and grinding between teeth. In the kitchen, she moved through her routine, chopping onions, checking supplies, and stirring a pot large enough to feed 100 men. The smells of garlic and oil drifted through the mess hall, mixing with the bitter scent of burned coffee. Soldiers shuffled in and out, their boots leaving trails of sand across the floor. To anyone watching, it was ordinary. But war has a way of turning ordinary into chaos in the blink of an eye. The first sign was subtle. A low rumble, faint but distinct, rolling through the walls like distant thunder. She paused, ladle in hand, listening. A second later, the thunder became a roar. The base shook as mortar slammed into the perimeter. Alarms screamed to life. Shouts echoed across the compound. The soldiers in the mess hall dropped their trays and scrambled for their weapons. She didn't move at first, frozen by the shockwave rattling the pots on the stove. Another explosion followed, closer this time, sending vibrations through the floor. Dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere outside, gunfire cracked sharply, rapid, and relentless. Her heart pounded, but her hands steadied. She knew in that instant the day she had quietly prepared for had arrived. The kitchen was no longer safe. She ducked low, sprinted across the room, and shoved open the heavy door that led to the rooftop access. Smoke filled the air as she climbed the ladder, each step echoing like a drumbeat in her chest. She carried nothing but instinct and the knowledge that rifles were always stashed near the guard posts above. When she reached the rooftop, the scene that greeted her was apocalyptic. Black smoke curled into the sky from the outer wall. The air trembled with gunfire, shouts, and the metallic clatter of return fire. The enemy had struck fast and hard, pouring lead into the compound from hidden positions beyond the perimeter. From her vantage point, she saw them, shadows darting between ruins, rifles flashing. And then she saw the glint of a scope an enemy sniper perched in a broken building, sighting in on one of the towers. Her breath caught, but her mind was clear. She dropped behind a sandbag position, her hands finding the cold steel of a rifle left by one of the guards. It wasn't her weapon, but it didn't matter. She racked the bolt, pressed her cheek against the stock, and lined up her sights. The sniper across the way shifted slightly, adjusting his aim toward the tower. She exhaled slowly, her finger tightening on the trigger. The rifle bucked, and the distant figure dropped. Silence filled her head for a fraction of a second, even as the chaos raged around her. She had just killed a man. There was no time to process it. Another flash drew her eye an enemy crouched with an RPG, preparing to launch. She swung, aimed, fired. The man collapsed, the rocket clattering harmlessly to the ground. Shouts erupted from the soldiers below. They hadn't expected fire support from the kitchen staff, but they recognized what was happening. Her shots were saving lives. She stayed low, scanning, searching. The world narrowed to her rifle scope. Targets appeared and disappeared in the haze of smoke and dust. Each time, her breathing slowed, her fingers squeezed, and another threat fell. She was no longer the quiet cook who stirred stew in the mornings. She was something else entirely, something that even she hadn't fully understood until now. Minutes stretched like hours. The battle surged, peaked, and slowly began to tilt in the defenders' favor. Her precision thinned the enemy ranks, buying time for reinforcements to reposition. The SEALs on the ground coordinated their counterattack, pushing forward with renewed force. She could hear their radios crackling, their voices sharp but steady. Sniper supports keeping them pinned. Move, move. When the last of the gunfire faded and the smoke began to clear, the base stood battered but unbroken. The enemy had been driven back, leaving silence and wreckage in their wake. She lowered the rifle, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. Her chest rose and fell in heavy breaths. She stared at the weapon in her lap, at the empty magazines scattered around her. The realization sank in. She had crossed a line that morning, one she could never return from. Soldiers climbed up to the rooftop, their faces smeared with dust and sweat. They looked at her with a mix of awe and disbelief. One of them, an infantry sergeant she'd served meals to countless times, spoke first. You just saved the damn base." She didn't know what to say. Her throat was dry, her words caught between pride and disbelief. She managed only a nod. Another soldier clapped her on the shoulder. "We'd be hauling bodies right now if it weren't for you." The SEALs arrived last, moving with their usual quiet authority. They examined the field through binoculars, then turned their attention to her. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You did good," he said simply. But the weight of his tone made it clear this was no casual compliment. It was respect, the kind they rarely offered. As the adrenaline ebbed, fatigue swept over her. She was suddenly aware of the blood pounding in her ears, the dryness in her mouth, the ache in her shoulders from hours of holding steady. Yet beneath it all was something else, clarity. For weeks she had prepared quietly, training in secret, sharpening a skill few had taken seriously. And now, when the moment came, she had delivered. Down in the mess hall, her pot still sat on the stove, the stew long since burned. The kitchen smelled of charred food and smoke. No one cared. No one would ever look at that kitchen the same way again. That day, the cook had stepped into the fire and become something else entirely. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't sought it. But when war demanded, she answered. And the men who witnessed it would carry the memory with them forever. It was the day everything changed. The battle had ended, but inside her, the war was just beginning. She lay on the rooftop, the rifle still warm against her palms. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and cordite, and the horizon shimmered with the heat of the desert sun. Around her, soldiers moved with exhausted purpose, dragging sandbags back into place, carrying the wounded, sweeping for any signs of a second attack. To them, the fight was over. To her, it felt as if something new had just started. She had crossed a threshold she hadn't realized was there. Before today, she had been a cook who happened to shoot well at the range. Now, after those shots that had broken the ambush, she was something different in their eyes. No longer invisible, no longer background. She had seen through the smoke, locked on to targets, and ended threats with a clarity that even trained soldiers respected. And that clarity hadn't been luck. It was something deeper, something she hadn't yet found the words for. That evening, the SEALs pulled her aside. They didn't make speeches or clap her on the back like the infantrymen had. They simply stood with her in the cooling dusk, their faces serious, their words measured. "You've got an eye," one of them said. She frowned. "What do you mean?" He gestured to the rifle still slung across her chest. "You saw things most people don't. The sniper in the rubble, the RPG team. Most wouldn't have noticed. But you did." She didn't respond right away. It wasn't pride she felt, it was unease. She hadn't set out to be noticed. She had just done what felt necessary. But their eyes told her this wasn't something that could be brushed aside. Some people, another SEAL added, are born with the sniper's eye. Doesn't matter how they were trained or what they do for a living. They see, they process, they act. You've got it. The words hung in the air. She wanted to argue, to say she was just a cook, that she had no business being compared to trained snipers. But deep down, she knew they were right. The next day, the whispers spread across the base. Soldiers who had once passed her in silence now stopped to glance at her, nodding with a respect she hadn't asked for. In the mess hall, trays clattered as men retold the story, how she dropped enemies one after another while the rest scrambled for cover. She could hear their voices, though she tried to block them out. She nailed a sniper at 400 meters. Cook? She's no cook anymore, I swear. The SEALs were watching her like she was one of them. She kept her head down, serving meals as if nothing had changed. But everything had. At night, she returned to the range. Not to prove anything to the others, but to prove something to herself. Each shot was a question. Was it real, what she'd done? Was it repeatable, or just adrenaline and chance? The answer came with every grouping, tight and precise, as if the rifle were simply an extension of her body. The SEALs noticed. They didn't make it formal, but every now and then, one of them would join her. They corrected her stance, adjusted her breathing, handed her a scope, and taught her how to range targets at different distances. She absorbed everything, quiet and relentless. One night, after a long session, one of them asked, "Do you know why you shoot like this?" She shook her head. "Because you don't see obstacles. You see lines, angles. You see the path between you and the target, and nothing else matters." That's rare. His words unsettled her. She had never thought of herself that way. To her, shooting wasn't mystical, it was methodical. A matter of breath, patience, and stillness. Yet she couldn't deny the truth in his observation. When she looked through a scope, the chaos of the world seemed to fall away. The battlefield became a puzzle, and her job was to solve it one shot at a time. The next test came sooner than anyone expected. 2 weeks after the ambush, another attack hit the base, this time at night. Mortar rained down, lighting up the darkness with sudden bursts of fire. The alarm screamed, boots pounded the ground, and soldiers scrambled for defensive positions. She didn't hesitate. Rifle in hand, she moved to the same rooftop, her body responding before her mind could catch up. The night was alive with muzzle flashes, tracer rounds streaking like red comets across the sky. From her elevated position, she scanned the darkness. And there it was, the telltale flicker of a muzzle flash from an enemy sniper hidden among the rocks. She steadied her breathing, let the chaos fade, and squeezed the trigger. A single shot cut through the night, silencing the flash. Another movement caught her eye, 3 figures advancing with heavy weapons. She shifted, fired once, twice, 3 times. Each figure dropped, their silhouettes crumpling into the sand. Around her, soldiers cheered. She's doing it again. She's covering us. But she barely heard them. She was locked in the zone, her focus razor-sharp. Targets appeared, and she eliminated them with mechanical precision. The battle raged for over an hour, but with her overwatch, the defenders held firm. When dawn broke, the base was still standing. Exhausted soldiers slumped against sandbags, their eyes heavy, their bodies drained. But they all looked toward the rooftop, toward the cook who had become their guardian. The SEALs approached her afterward, their faces grim but approving. "You're not just lucky," one said. "You've got the sniper's eye." And that's not something we forget. She wanted to argue again, to remind them that she was a cook, not a trained operator. But the truth was undeniable. Twice now, She had stepped into the storm and seen clearly when others couldn't. Twice, she had made the difference between survival and disaster. That night, as she cleaned her rifle under the faint glow of a lantern, she finally allowed herself to acknowledge what the SEALs had already seen. She wasn't just a cook. She wasn't even just a good shot. She had something rare, something that set her apart. The sniper's eye. It wasn't a title she wanted. It wasn't a role she had sought. But it was hers now, and with it came a weight she could not put down. The war had chosen her, whether she liked it or not. And the SEALs, hardened men who had seen countless battles, had already decided this was one story they would carry with them forever. Respect in the military isn't handed out. It's not something earned through words or rank or even the uniform you wear. Respect is forged in fire through what you do when everything is on the line. The SEALs, perhaps more than anyone else, lived by this code. They didn't care about background or job title or what someone claimed they could do. They cared about results. And she had delivered results that none of them could ignore. Still, respect from men like them wasn't immediate. It wasn't given after a single battle, even one as dramatic as hers. It was measured, cautious, tested. They had seen too much to be swayed by one extraordinary moment. But as the days turned into weeks, and the whispers of her marksmanship became solid truth, the SEALs began to take notice. The first sign came in small gestures. A nod from one of them in the mess hall. A wordless acknowledgement when she passed. These men were legends in their own right, feared and respected across the military. Yet they chose to extend a thread of recognition to a cook who had stood her ground when bullets filled the air. For her, it was strange. She had never sought their attention, and in truth, she felt uneasy under their gaze. She wasn't one of them. She hadn't endured boot-e, hadn't gone through years of specialized training. She was just a woman who cooked meals and happened to shoot well when it mattered. And yet, something had shifted between them. One afternoon, after a long shift in the kitchen, she found herself walking past the SEALs training area. They were running drills in the scorching heat, moving in perfect sync, their rifles barking in precise rhythm. She paused for a moment, fascinated by the fluidity of their motions. It was like watching a dance, every step purposeful, every gesture rehearsed until it became instinct. One of the SEALs noticed her and waved her over. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She pointed at herself, unsure. He nodded. Reluctantly, she stepped closer. "Grab a rifle," he said simply, tossing one toward her. She caught it awkwardly. "I'm not." "Yeah, you are," he interrupted. "We've seen you." The others smirked, some skeptical, others curious. They didn't go easy on her. The drill was brutal, running, diving, reloading under pressure. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her lungs burned in the heat, but she kept moving. When it came time to shoot, she did what she always did, slowed her breathing, locked her focus, and let the world fade away. Targets dropped, one after another. The smirks faded. By the end, even the skeptics were silent. She expected mockery, maybe a dismissive "not bad for a cook," but instead, one of the SEALs handed her a canteen, his face unreadable. "You kept up," he said. In their language, that was praise. From then on, they began to include her in small ways. Not official training, nothing that would break protocol, but informal lessons. A word of advice here, a demonstration there. How to adjust a scope in low light. How to pick out movement at long distances. How to time a shot between heartbeats. They didn't call it mentorship, but that's what it was. The respect grew in battle, too. Another attack on the base forced everyone to their positions. This time, the SEALs didn't question her presence on the rooftop. They expected it. They trusted her to watch their flanks, to pick off threats they couldn't reach. And she did. With each shot, she reinforced what they had already begun to accept. She was reliable, precise, and unflinching under fire. It wasn't long before one of them said aloud what they were all thinking. "She's not a cook anymore. She's one of us." The words struck her deeply. She didn't know whether to feel pride or fear. Being one of them was no small thing. It meant carrying the weight of expectation. It meant stepping into a role she hadn't trained for, hadn't asked for. But she couldn't deny the truth of it. She had already stepped into that role the moment she squeezed the trigger during the ambush. The respect of the SEALs wasn't just about her shooting, though. It was about her composure. Many trained soldiers, even seasoned ones, could crumble under pressure. The chaos of combat could make hands shake, minds falter. But not hers. She didn't panic, didn't hesitate. She stayed calm, almost unnervingly so, as if her mind slowed the world down when bullets flew. They noticed. One evening, sitting together after a patrol, a SEAL asked her, "What goes through your head when you line up a shot?" She thought about it carefully. "Nothing," she said at last. "Everything else just disappears. It's only me and the target." The SEAL nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. "That's the difference. Most people fight their thoughts in the middle of it. You don't. You're already where we trained to be." The others agreed silently. Respect, real respect, had been cemented. Still, she never let it change her. In the kitchen, she returned to her pots and pans. She served meals, wiped tables, scrubbed dishes with the same quiet discipline she always had. But to the SEALs, and to every soldier who had seen her in battle, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was part of the backbone of the base's defense, a symbol of calm under fire. The phrase began to circulate, "She'll never let you down." One SEAL, hardened by years of war, summed it up best after a firefight where her precision had saved them yet again. He looked at her, his voice low but firm. "We'll never forget what you've done for us." And they meant it. Respect wasn't just earned that day, it was sealed for life. The kitchen was supposed to be her world. Stainless steel counters, simmering pots, the clatter of pans, it was a rhythm she knew by heart. But now, every time she stirred a pot or lifted a tray, she felt the weight of the rifle that rested quietly in her quarters. The two identities, cook and sniper, warred inside her, neither one fitting perfectly, yet both demanding space. The soldiers still lined up for meals, their chatter filling the mess hall. But the way they looked at her had changed. It was subtle, but she felt it. They no longer saw just the woman behind the counter. They saw the one who had stood on the rooftop, rifle steady, cutting down threats in the chaos. Some were too respectful to say anything. Others offered quiet nods, or murmured thanks as they passed. The SEALs, however, didn't bother with subtlety. To them, she had crossed an invisible threshold. They no longer treated her like background staff. They treated her like a fellow warrior. And though she never asked for it, they pulled her into their orbit. At first, it was informal, an invitation to watch them train, an offhand remark about tactics, a suggestion to try a new scope. But soon, it became something more structured. They'd hand her a rifle during drills, bark orders, push her to move faster, shoot quicker, think sharper. It wasn't play. It wasn't for fun. They were testing her, molding her. "You've got instincts we can't waste," one of them said flatly during a training session. She wanted to argue, to remind them that she was a cook, not a soldier. But the truth was, she no longer believed that herself. The kitchen still mattered. It was her duty, her post. But the battlefield had claimed a piece of her, and it wasn't letting go. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, she sat alone with her rifle on her lap. The metal was cool against her skin, the weight both comforting and heavy. She thought about who she had been when she first arrived at the base. Invisible, ordinary, safe in her corner of the war. That woman seemed like a stranger now. The battlefield had rewritten her story in a language she didn't fully understand. Her transition didn't go unnoticed. The base commander called her in one morning, his expression caught between concern and admiration. "You weren't sent here to fight," he reminded her. "I know, sir," she said softly. "But you've saved lives." "More than once." He paused, studying her. "Just remember, every bullet you fire changes you. Don't lose yourself." She nodded, though she wasn't sure what herself even meant anymore. The next mission made the question unavoidable. A convoy leaving the base needed overwatch. Normally, that role would fall to trained sharpshooters. But the SEALs, with a confidence that startled her, requested her by name. The commander hesitated. She wasn't cleared for such a role. She wasn't trained, at least not officially. But in the end, results outweighed protocol. She was sent. The desert stretched endlessly before them, the convoy kicking up trails of dust as it moved. She rode in the back of a Humvee, rifle across her lap, eyes scanning the horizon. Every dune looked like it could hide danger. Every shadow felt alive. And then the danger came. Gunfire erupted from a ridge, the convoy trapped in a sudden hail of bullets. Soldiers dove for cover, return fire rattling across the sand. Amid the chaos, she climbed to the roof of the Humvee, heart steady, eyes sharp. She scanned, saw the flicker of an enemy muzzle flash, and squeezed the trigger. One down, then another. Her shots weren't frantic. They were deliberate, precise, cutting through the noise like a scalpel. "Cover fire. Move." The SEALs shouted, trusting her to watch their advance. And she did. Every time one of them sprinted, she shielded them with a rifle, dropping threats before they could react. When the firefight ended, the convoy was intact. No American lives lost. The SEALs gathered around her, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. One of them clapped her shoulder, his voice gruff but sincere. "You're not just filling in. You belong out here." The words echoed in her chest. She didn't know if she wanted to belong, but the truth was undeniable. She had crossed from kitchen to battlefield, and there was no turning back. Back at the base, things changed again. The soldiers began asking her questions, not just about cooking, but about shooting, about what it felt like to stay calm under fire. Some even requested her presence during training exercises, eager to learn from the cook who became a sniper. She never boasted, never bragged. She kept her answers short, her tone humble. But inside, she felt the shift. The kitchen was no longer her entire identity. The battlefield had carved its mark too deeply. Still, she refused to abandon the kitchen. Every day she returned to her duties, stirring pots, serving meals, wiping down counters. To some, it seemed absurd, a woman who could outshoot seasoned soldiers choosing to ladle soup. But for her, it was balance. The kitchen grounded her. It reminded her that she was still human, still herself, not just the weapon the war wanted her to be. The SEALs understood, even if others didn't. One night, after another firefight where she had saved lives, one of them found her scrubbing pans in silence. "You know," he said, "most people would trade that rifle for a medal by now." She looked up, her hands still wet with suds. "I don't need medals. I just need to know I did the right thing." The SEAL nodded, a rare smile touching his lips. "That's why we respect you." The respect deepened with every mission. She wasn't officially one of them, but when the SEALs moved, they looked for her. When they planned, they asked her opinion. When they fought, they trusted her to cover them. And each time, she proved them right. But the kitchen never let her go, and she never let it go either. Between missions, she returned to the clatter of trays and the aroma of spices, serving meals to the same soldiers she had shielded hours before. And in that strange duality, she found a truth. She was both. Cook and sniper. Caregiver and protector. Life and death, held in one pair of hands. Her journey from kitchen to battlefield wasn't about leaving one behind. It was about carrying both, side by side. And the SEALs, hardened warriors who had seen everything, recognized that balance for what it was. To them, it wasn't weakness. It was strength. The kind of strength they would never forget. It was strange how a single day could ripple outward and change everything. To her, it had been instinct grabbing a rifle, climbing to high ground, and doing what needed to be done when lives were at stake. She hadn't thought about heroism or legacy. She had thought only about survival, about protecting the men whose lives depended on her vision and her trigger finger. But to the soldiers around her, that one day became something more. It became a story. And stories, once born in war, had a way of outliving the battles themselves. At first, it was just murmurs across the base. Soldiers telling each other about the cook who turned the tide. They described her shots with awe, as though she had defied the laws of chance. They marveled at her calmness under fire, her ability to see what others had missed. The whispers grew, carrying from one unit to the next. Soon, even soldiers who hadn't been present spoke of her as if they had. She saved the base, one would say. She took out snipers like it was nothing, another added. She was just a cook, someone whispered, as though that detail made the story almost mythical. It wasn't long before the story slipped beyond the desert and back to the States. Letters home carried fragments of it. Soldiers wrote about the cook who became a sniper in the blink of an eye, who protected SEALs and infantry alike, who refused medals and went back to stirring soup as though nothing had happened. Families told neighbors, neighbors told friends, and the legend began to take on a life of its own. But inside the base, she carried no sense of legend. She felt only the weight of expectation. Each time the alarm sounded, soldiers looked to her rooftop. Each time a convoy left the wire, they glanced her way, silently asking if she would be there. It wasn't pressure she had asked for, but it was pressure she bore with quiet dignity. Because she knew what they didn't say aloud. If she faltered, lives would be lost. One night, she sat outside with a group of soldiers who had gathered around a small fire. They were young, many of them barely out of their teens. Their faces were tired, their eyes heavy with the shadows of things they had already seen. Yet when they looked at her, there was something else too. Hope. You know, one soldier said, his voice quiet, I think about that day a lot. The day you climbed up there. If you hadn't. He trailed off, shaking his head. I probably wouldn't be sitting here. She looked at him, unsure what to say. Words had always come easier with food, with meals that comforted men in silence. But words about war? About saving lives? Those she never knew how to shape. So she just nodded and poked the fire with a stick. We all did what we had to do, she said finally. But the soldier wasn't satisfied. He leaned forward, his eyes steady. No, you did what nobody else could. The group fell silent. The crackle of flames filled the void. And in that silence, she realized something. Her story had become more than hers. It belonged to them now. To the men who needed it. It gave them proof that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary moments. That no one was ever truly just anything. That courage could come from the most unexpected places, and when it did, it could change the outcome of an entire battle. The SEALs understood this too. They didn't speak of her as a legend, they spoke of her as a comrade. But even they recognized that what she had done would outlast their tours, their missions, their careers. This story's not going away. One of them told her bluntly as they walked the perimeter one evening. "You may not like it, but it's bigger than you now." She frowned. "I didn't do it for a story." "I know," he replied. "That's why it's a story worth telling." The weight of that truth sat heavy on her. She had always lived in the background, happy to serve without notice. But war had thrust her into the light, and no matter how much she tried to retreat into the kitchen, the story followed her. Soldiers told it to new arrivals. Officers referenced it in speeches. Even when she tried to deflect praise, the respect in their eyes lingered. And yet, she never let it change her routine. Each morning, she rose before dawn, tied her apron, and began chopping vegetables. The kitchen was her sanctuary, her way of holding on to the parts of herself untouched by combat. She fed the men, smiled at their jokes, scolded them gently when they left trays behind. To them, it was almost surreal. This woman who saved their lives also handed them mashed potatoes and cleaned up after them. It was that contrast, perhaps, that cemented her legacy. She wasn't untouchable, wasn't above them. She was among them human, ordinary, yet capable of something extraordinary. Months later, when rotations shifted and some of the SEALs prepared to leave, they gathered around her in the mess hall for one last meal together. They didn't make speeches, but one of them stood before leaving, his voice low but firm. "Men like us, we've fought alongside legends. We've buried some of them too. But you're the kind of legend that keeps living." Because nobody forgets the day a cook became a sniper and saved us all, the mess hall was silent. For once, she didn't argue. She simply lowered her eyes, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and let the words sink into her bones. She didn't want to be a legend, but she had become one anyway. And as the soldiers carried the story with them back home, into other units, into their futures, it grew into something she could no longer control. It became a reminder, a lesson, a spark of hope whispered in barracks across the world. Sometimes, the quietest among us carry the loudest courage. Sometimes, one day is enough to change everything. Years later, when the war had shifted to new fronts, and the desert base had become just another footprint in the dust of history, the SEALs still spoke of her. Not in official reports, not in public ceremonies, but in the quiet spaces where warriors remembered the things that had shaped them most, the firelight conversations, the reunions in dimly lit bars, the stories told to younger men who wanted to know what combat really felt like. They remembered her, not just the precision of her shots, though those were unforgettable. Not just the way she had seen threats hidden in rubble and shadows, though that had saved their lives more than once. They remembered her presence steady, unshakable, a calm in the storm when everything else was chaos. She was different, one SEAL would say, shaking his head as if trying to capture the essence in words. She wasn't trained for it. She wasn't supposed to be there. But when it mattered, she was the sharpest eye in the fight. Another would add, she never asked for recognition. She never wanted medals. Hell, she went right back to cooking after pulling us out of the fire. That's the kind of courage you don't forget. It wasn't just courage, though. It was humility. The SEALs had seen men lose themselves in the thirst for glory. They had seen soldiers chase medals, careers built on claiming credit for moments of chance. But she had been the opposite. She didn't claim. She didn't boast. She acted, then returned to her duties, as if saving lives had been no different than serving meals. That humility struck the SEALs harder than any medal ever could. Because they knew the truth. It was the ones who didn't seek the spotlight who often carried the most genuine strength. When they gathered years later for reunions, someone would inevitably bring up her name. The story would come alive again, passed around the table like a sacred memory. They'd describe the rooftop, the dust, the sharp crack of her rifle cutting through the air. They'd recall the stunned silence when they realized it wasn't one of their own, but a cook shielding them from death with each shot. And then, always, someone would say the words that had become a refrain among them. "We'll never forget." The phrase wasn't empty. It wasn't casual. It carried weight, the weight of lives spared, of brothers brought home, of missions completed because one woman chose to see clearly when others could not. Some SEALs told the story to their families, though always in fragments. A wife might hear about a cook who saved us all one night. A son might be told, "Never underestimate anyone, not after what I saw her do." The details blurred, as they always did with war stories, but the core remained: respect, memory, gratitude. Others carried it quietly, never speaking her name outside their circle. Not because they wanted to hoard the story, but because some things were too sacred, too personal to be shared with the world at large. For her, life moved on differently. She never saw herself as a legend, though she knew the whispers would never stop. She rotated home eventually, returning to a world that didn't understand the duality she carried inside cook and sniper, nurturer and protector. To neighbors, she was simply a veteran, quiet and unassuming. Few ever guessed what she had done, what she had meant to those SEALs on that rooftop. But for the men who had been there, her name was etched into memory as surely as any inscription on a wall of honor. They remembered the way she steadied her breathing when the world was on fire. They remembered the look in her eyes, not hardened like theirs, but focused, determined, a clarity that didn't need years of training to sharpen. They remembered the silence after each shot, the way it cut through the chaos and made space for them to breathe, to fight, to live. They remembered, too, the balance she carried, how she could wield death with unflinching precision, then return to the kitchen to ladle soup with the same steady hands. How she embodied something rare, the truth that warriors are not born in titles or ranks, but in choices, in moments, in the willingness to stand when standing seems impossible. The SEALs had fought beside many warriors, but she was the kind they spoke of when they wanted to remind themselves why they fought. Not for medals, not for glory, but for each other, for the quiet strength that rose from unexpected places, for the cook who became their shield. And as the years stretched on, the story didn't fade. It became a part of their collective memory, passed on not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. One SEAL, grizzled with age, put it best when he told the story to a young recruit eager for tales of battle. "You want to know what a warrior looks like?" he asked. "Forget the movies. Forget the speeches. A warrior is someone who does what needs to be done, no matter who they are or what their job says." One day, a cook picked up a rifle and saved an entire base. That's the kind of thing you don't forget. That's the kind of thing you carry with you for the rest of your life. The recruit asked what happened to her, where she was now. The old SEAL just smiled faintly. "Doesn't matter. What matters is, when we needed her, she was there." And that's all any of us could ever ask for. And so the memory lived on, not as a headline, not as a footnote in history books, but as something far more enduring. A story carried in the hearts of the men she saved, etched into the unspoken brotherhood of warriors. Because in the end, medals tarnish, names fade, and wars blur into the sands of time. But what the SEALs remembered, what they swore they would never forget, was the cook who became a sniper in seconds, who asked for nothing, who gave everything, and who proved that courage could come from the most ordinary of places. That was her legacy. That was what the SEALs remembered.